I'll tell you what, I will give $10,000 to the PLO in your name if you can find a historical fact in my book that you can prove to be false. I issue that challenge. I issue it to you. I issue it to the Palestinian Authority. I issue it to Noam Chomsky. I issue it to Edward Said. Every word in my book is accurate, and you can't just simply say it's false without documenting it. Tell me one thing in the book now that is false.
Well, I appreciate Alan Dershowitz's seriousness, at least in these remarks. I have no intention whatsoever of getting involved in an ad hominem debate with Mr. Dershowitz. I'm interested in the facts. I was asked to come in and discuss his new book. I went home, purchased one copy. In fact, I purchased 2 copies. I read the book very carefully. I did what someone serious does with a book. I read the text. I went through the footnotes. I went through it very carefully. And there's only one conclusion one can reach, having read the book. And this is a scholarly judgment. It's not an ad hominem attack. Mr. Dershowitz has concocted a fraud. In fact, Mr. Dershowitz has concocted a fraud which, amazingly, in large parts, he plagiarized from another fraud. Now, I found that pretty shocking. Found it shocking coming from a Harvard professor. I find it shocking coming from any professor.
Now, we have to cut off at one point. I just want to warn everybody here that, although I'm not a litigious person, when you make allegations of plagiarism, when you make allegations of plagiarism, that's a technical term which has great legal implications.
I agree.
And, you know, I can't obviously sit quietly by and, accept an allegation.
Let's look at the evidence. In the first 2 chapters of your book, you extensively reproduce all of Joan Peters' pages in her book. I read it carefully. In 1984,
show me
I'm going to show you.
Show me one sentence.
I am going to show you.
Okay.
I think I made available the charts to you.
No, you've shown me nothing. Let's start with that. That's a categorical lie.
Alan,
what you're hearing now on radio is that a claim that Mr. Finkelstein made available to me certain charts.
No,
that is
a
categorical lie.
No. Okay, Mr. Dershowitz, I think you had about 5 minutes time. I wasn't looking at the clock. If we're going to have a civil debate, you're going to have to remain...
But it's not going to be a debate about me. Let me be very clear about that.
I'm not debating you. I have no interest in you, Mr. Dershowitz.
Right.
None at all. I'm interested in the scholarship, and I'm interested in the facts, and I'm interested in your book. Now, in 1984, one Joan Peters published a book called From Time Immemorial. The book was universally recognized by serious scholars to be a fraud. Without wanting to toot my own horn, I'm widely recognized as the person who exposed the fraud. I know that book inside out. I read it at least 4 times, and I went through all 1,854 footnotes. I started to read your book, Mr. Dershowitz. I then came to chapter 1, footnotes 10, footnote 11, footnote 12, footnote 13, footnote 14, footnote 15, footnote 16. All of the quotes are from Joan Peters. They are so from Joan Peters that you have a long quote here from Mark Twain on pages 23 to 24. I turn to Joan Peters, page 159 to 60. The identical quote from Twain with the ellipses.
Is the Twain quote wrong?
With the ellipses.
Is the Twain
let
quote
me finish,
wrong?
sir.
No, but the key
with
is...
the ellipses in the same places. The identical quote from Twain with the ellipses in the same places.
It's been widely quoted, as you know.
Really,
now,
Mr. Dershowitz?
What's your point? Is it a correct quote?
Let me finish, Mr. Dershowitz.
You
have nearly a full-page quote from one William Young, a British consul from May 1839.
Is it an accurate
quote? On page 8, I'm going to finish, sir. On page 18 of your book, I turn to Joan Peters, page 184, the identical quote with the ellipses. I'm holding it up for the camera. Perhaps they can see. This is the length of the quote.
Is it an accurate quote?
The ellipses in the identical place. Last point. I'm not going to go through chapter 2 where there are 29 plagiarisms from Joan Peters.
Wait. Let's be very clear. It is not plagiarism to quote Mark Twain correctly. That's not
except
plagiarism.
if you cite Mark Twain and not Joan Peters. I'm a professor, sir. I know what plagiarism is.
And plagiarism is? Well, let's hear your definition of plagiarism.
No, we're not going to get involved in that now.
So you're using a word and you're not going to tell us what you mean by it.
I'm going to give the documentation, and you know what? We'll let everybody else decide for themselves, because the documentation... One last example, and I want to make it very clear. In Joan Peters' book, From Time Immemorial, she coins a phrase. The phrase is turn speak, and she said...
No, she borrows it from... No, she borrows it from who is it?
I'm sorry.
No, she attributes it and borrows it from somebody else. It's not her own phrase.
She coins the phrase, you see, you don't know what you're talking about, and that's pretty terrible. She coined the phrase turn speak, and she says she's using it as a play off of George Orwell, which, as all listeners know, used the phrase newspeak.
Right.
And she coined her own phrase, turn speak. You go to Mr. Dershowitz's book, he got so confused in his massive borrowings from Joan Peters that on 2 occasions, I'll cite them for those who have a copy of the book, on page 57 and on page 153, he uses the phrase, quote, George Orwell's turn speak. Turn speak is not Orwell, Mr. Dershowitz. You're the Felix Frankfurter Chair at Harvard.
Yes.
You must know that Orwell would never use such a clunky phrase as turn speak.
I like it. I think it's a very elegant phrase.
Maybe you like it, and evidently Joan Peters liked it.
It's a frivolous charge, of course. What happened was this. Of course, I read the Peters book. Anybody writing a book on the Middle East would. I also read a book called The Myths and Facts, which is a book put out originally by APAC and then published separately and independently, and probably 30 or 40 other books which use the same quotes. They're very extensively used quotes by Mark Twain, because Mark Twain traveled to Palestine. Mark Twain's a very prominent American writer, and what he saw in Palestine is very relevant to the debate. He saw barren lands. He didn't see a Palestinian community. He saw empty roads, and he writes extremely vividly. A scholar is entitled to read a book, as I did of Peters' book, and to find quotes in the book and check them against the original quotes, and then do what I did. I don't know whether or not Mr. Finkelstein read footnote 31 that appears on page 246, which says, the research of French cartographer Vital Kuntz are relied on for the conclusions. So I may have mispronounced it, I'm sorry.
No, you misspelled it.
And then I say, see Joan Peters from Time Immemorial, Chicago, etc. And then I say, Peters' conclusions and data have been challenged. And then I quote from Said and Hutchins, I do not in any way rely on them in this book. What I did, and it's very common for scholars to do that, is I read her books, I read Mr. Finkelstein's criticism of them, and I came away with enough doubt about the conclusions that, although I don't regard the Peters book in any way as a fraud, I think it was a well-intentioned effort to recreate the very difficult to recreate events that existed in 1890 and 1900. I did find her quotes, which have been, as I said, used extensively by Facts and Myths and other publications, to be quite compelling. And she led me, I mean, I don't purport, this book and none of my writing I don't purport to be an independent historian who goes back to the Middle East and reads original documents. I'm making a case. I'm doing what a lawyer would do. And what lawyers do is they find sources, they check the sources. I had a research staff that obviously checked the sources. I haven't heard a word from Mr. Finkelstein suggesting that the quote from Mark Twain is not an accurate quote. Now, if Peters had made up a quote from Mark Twain, and it hadn't existed, Mark Twain had never written it, and then somebody borrowed the quote without going to check back on whether Mark Twain had said that, I've done nothing like that. The vast majority of my book deals with current situations. In fact, I start my book by saying there has to be a statute of limitations on grievances. I don't try to base the case for Israel on the fact that Jews lived in Palestine before the birth of Jesus, or the fact that Jews were expelled from what is now Israel in 72 AD. And I argue that Palestinians can't really make the case against a two-state solution based on historic claims that go back 100 years. But in the first couple of chapters, which are quite brief, I recount, never purporting to be creative or original in the recounting, I recount what has been accepted as the traditional history, and that traditional history includes the land, particularly what is now what would be Western Palestine, what was the part of Palestine allocated to Israel in the 1947 division, was land that before the Jews got there in the first Aliyah, about 1880-something, and the second Aliyah in the beginning of the 20th century, was land that was coming into disuse. Now, these are controversial, by the way. There are some Palestinians who say you shouldn't trust Mark Twain. There are some Palestinians who say you shouldn't trust the various English travelers. Reasonable people could disagree about that. I quote those sources. I lay them out there for people to read so that they can evaluate the claims that Israel was established on the basis of colonialism. I make the following argument, which I'd love to hear Mr. Finkelstein rebut. You can't be a colonialist country unless another country sent people there as soldiers to take over that country. For example, France sent its settlers to Algeria. England sent its settlers to India. Dutch and other countries sent their settlers to parts of Africa with guns to take over. What did the Jews do during the first Aliyah and the second Aliyah? They escaped from countries that were persecuting them. They escaped from Russia. They escaped from Poland. They escaped from Lithuania. They didn't come at the request of those countries. If you claim people were colonialists, you have to say on whose behalf they were working. The Jews who came there weren't working on behalf of Russia. They weren't working on behalf of Poland. They weren't Lithuania. They came as refugees, much like American Jews came as refugees to America. The ones who went to Palestine went with rakes and hoes to try to build the land, to try to join collectively with the local population. They did, in fact, improve the land. As a result of work projects in Western Palestine, many Arabs from Eastern Palestine moved there. I cite statistics. Peters cites the same statistics, in fact, showing that in various kibbutzim, Rishon LeZion and others, the fact that 100, I don't remember the exact numbers, Jews moved there attracted 300 or 400. You may disagree with it, but those are the data that I presented, and we can reasonably disagree with that.
Okay.
Now, I just want to make one point about Mr. Finkelstein's research. Well, I don't want to get ad hominem. I don't want to get into this debate, but for example, I do quote Mr. Finkelstein at one point, I think only once in the book, and that is he makes an argument in Edward Said's collection that to judge the 1947 partition, the only fair way to do it is to look at either all of Palestine, which I don't know whether he means to include what became Jordan, Transjordan, or not, or you have to look at what became of Israel after the 1948 war. I disagree with that. What I say, respectfully, in the book, is that when you look at the fairness of the 1947 petition, you only look at the land that was allocated to the state of Israel. And in that land, Jews were clearly a majority, according to the UN census. To be sure, once the Arab nations attacked Israel, once the Palestinians attacked Israel, there was a war, and Israel secured more land, which was regularized by a ceasefire in 1949. What Mr. Finkelstein does is he counts that land and says, aha, look at how much they got, and look at the proportion of Jews and Palestinians. That's not the correct demographic to look at. So, you know, we can have reasonable arguments
let's get
about
a response
this, but
to
let's stay away from the ad hominems and get to the merits of the case.
You know, Professor Dershowitz, I'm not a professor at Harvard, but I do.
You seem to resent that a lot.
But I do teach elsewhere. And when we discuss issues like falsifying information, plagiarizing, lifting whole cloth from other books, I've never heard that called ad hominem. For a serious scholar and a serious academic, those are very fundamental issues.
But when they're false, they're ad hominem.
Okay, no, if they're false, then you dispute them.
That's what
But to characterize them as ad hominem seems really out of court for a professor.
No, they are ad hominem. You said I don't deserve to teach at Harvard. That sounds pretty ad hominem to me.
Professor Dershowitz,
Finkelstein make his case.
you raised that issue I'll try to address it, and then we're returning to the substantive issues of your book.
First, tell me why I shouldn't be teaching
I'm going
at
to
Harvard.
refer to that.
Okay.
On page 207 of your book, you say that to deliberately misinform, miseducate, and misdirect students is a particularly nasty form of educational malpractice.
Of which I accuse
Now, I consider what you have done in the book to be a paradigmatic, a quintessential example of misinforming, miseducating, and misdirecting.
So
you go on. Allow me to finish.
Allow
me to finish, sure. Mr. Dershowitz. I've been very respectful of your time. On page 213, you discuss the Holocaust fraud by Robert Faurisson. And you write, quote, "There was no extensive historical research," referring to his book.
That's right.
Instead, there was the fraudulent manufacturing of false anti-history.
That's right. And Chomsky wrote, as you know, an introduction to
Please don't bring in Mr. Chomsky. He can defend himself. We're talking about you and your book. It was the kind of deception, referring to Faurisson's book, now let me quote clearly, for which professors are rightly fired.
I stand by that,
Not because their views are controversial, and let me underline this again, but because they are violating the most basic canons of historical scholarship.
Well, let me respond to that.
Now,
if you can compare me to Faurisson, if you can compare Faurisson made up a story that the Holocaust didn't occur.
I'm referring to your standard.
I
have no interest in Faurisson now. I'm talking about your standards.
Absolutely.
To miseducate, misinform, and misdirect, to violate the standards of historical scholarship are grounds for expulsion.
Absolutely.
So it's not an ad hominem argument. It's using your standard.
Norman Finkelstein.
Well, first of all, I want to clarify the monetary issue. Is it now $25,000?
It's $25,000 on that issue.
Oh, just on that issue. In general, it's $10,000.
And let me be very clear what I said.
We heard it. We just saw it on the tape.
Let me be very clear.
I think it's clear.
I then made it very clear. I said afterward, a material, willful distortion of fact.
Professor Dershowitz, it's on tape. We just saw it.
But we're not talking about a spelling mistake.
Oh, no, I'm not
we're not talking about a minor mistake and a footnote.
Far be it for me to be so trivial.
Serious material, willful mistake of fact that I deliberately engaged in.
Serious material facts.
Right.
Number one, I'm going to first deal with just concrete facts which are not particularly controversial, which can easily be confirmed. On page 80 of your book, you write that according to Benny Morris, between April and June...
Benny Morris being an Israeli
historian. I have a copy of his book here, which I'll hold up.
Right.
2,000 to 3,000 Palestinians were made refugees during the second stage of the flight. Here's the book in front of you.
Yeah.
Page 256. Can you read what the sentence says?
Well, let me read you what I say in my book. In some areas, Arab commanders...
Please
I'm quoting
don't read
from
the
Morris.
whole paragraph.
No, I'm just reading... In some... let me put the context. Chomsky says that... he says, Morris does not believe that any Arab leaders told the Palestinians to leave. And I say, in some areas, I quote from Morris, in some areas, Arab commanders ordered the villages to evacuate to clear the ground for military purposes to prevent surrender. More than half a dozen villages, etc., were abandoned during these months as a result of such orders. Elsewhere in East Jerusalem and in many villages around the country, the Arab commanders ordered women, old people, and children to be sent away out of harm's way. Indeed, psychological preparation for the removal of the dependents had begun in 47-48, when the Arab High Command and the Arab League had periodically endorsed such a move in contemplating the future of Palestine. And I say, therefore, Chomsky is simply wrong when he says that there's no evidence, and he says, again at another point, nobody today believes that any of the refugees were told to leave. And so I dispute that by quoting Morris himself.
You seem to have an obsession with Mr. Chomsky, but he's not here. I'm here. Let's look at the next sentence.
I thought I was going to be debating Chomsky today.
Let's look at the next sentence. Please, Mr. Dershowitz, this is serious.
I agree with you.
Read the next sentence. Morris estimates, in your book, I have it right in front of me, the next sentence.
Morris estimates that between 2,000 and 3,000 Arabs fled their homes during this phase of the Arab-initiated fighting.
Okay, can you please read what Mr. Morris wrote?
Well, no, you're talking about one...
Please read what he wrote.
If I have the whole book, I will find for you if you want to take
Norm
time.
Finkelstein, can you, if you want the
3,000 people led during this phase.
Can you read the sentence?
Okay, I'm looking at page 256 of Benny Morris's book, Righteous Victims, A History of the Zionist-Arab Conflict.
He's referring to phase 2 now, the same one as you. Go ahead.
And you're talking about right over here.
Altogether, yeah.
Altogether, about 200,000 to 300,000 Arabs fled their homes during the second stage of the Exodus.
There's between 2 and 3,000 and 2 and 300,000. Now, you could check this many times, Mr. Dershowitz, but you're really going to have to pay the $10,000.
No.
And I hope you allow me to I hope you allow me to earmark it for Janine. I would like to give it to Janine.
Let's be sure what the context is of this.
I know the context.
We're talking about a variety of
the OJ trial. This is not the OJ trial. We're not going to play a game.
Well,
we're not playing a game now.
Is your point that you're citing that what you're saying, Norm Finkelstein, is in Alan Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel? He says 2 to
3,000, and it's 2 to 300,000.
Your response to that,
I argue that 700,000 Arabs.
Don't change the subject, Mr. Dershowitz.
Changing the subject.
We're talking about phase 2,
700,000 Arabs.
Please don't play this game.
Obviously, the phrase 2 to 3,000 Arabs refers either to a sub-phase or is a typographical error.
This is why lawyers have a bad reputation. Because you're playing a game now. I've read the book twice. In fact, Mr.
Do I ever dispute that 700? Do I ever dispute that hundreds of thousands of people left?
In fact, I've read the book 6 times because I read Joan Peters 4 times.
Let me focus on the 2,000 or 3,000. This is such an obvious point when you think about it for a second. What is the context I'm arguing? I'm arguing that lots and lots of Arabs, in contradistinction to what Chomsky said, were told to leave by their Arab commanders. Obviously, it's in the interest of that argument to maximize the number who would leave. Only an idiot would deliberately minimize the number who's leave.
Let's refrain from ad hominem attacks.
No. I'm talking about myself.
Okay.
I'm talking about myself now.
Okay.
I would have been an idiot had I used 2,000 when the actual number was 2 to 300. If you wanted to make an accusation, you would say, instead of saying 2 to 300, he said 4 to 500,000. Remember the argument. The argument I'm making is that lots of the Palestinian refugees who left as the result of orders from their leaders during this period of time. So my incentive, if we take Mr. Finkelstein, would be to exaggerate the number. Now he accuses me of reducing the number by 100-fold. Obviously, there are only 2 possible explanations for that.
For factual errors.
But why would anyone make a factual error that would hurt their position?
Mr. Dershowitz,
Obviously,
it's
the
with all due respect,
allegation.
Mr. Dershowitz,
right?
With all due respect, I cannot understand for the life of me why someone with your reputation and with your accomplishments would cobble together a fraud. That, to me, is the most perplexing question.
Let me ask you a direct
question.
Let me ask you a direct question.
Let me just say something. We only have 10 minutes. We want to go to content.
I do, but I want to ask one direct question. Am I right or am I wrong that it would serve the interest of my argument to overstate rather than to understate
Mr. Dershowitz,
that
there is no
figure?
argument. There are no arguments in your book. Your book is a collection of fraud. Falsification,
let me give you the argument. Well, let me set out the argument. So this is an answer on the merits. Here's the argument.
I don't want to discuss your
we're going to close both mics here. We're closing both microphones, okay? We're going to go through this in a civilized way over the next 10 minutes. You have laid out a challenge, Professor Dershowitz, on Scarborough Country, the program on MSNBC. You said if anyone can find a factual error in the book, we're not talking spelling errors, that you will give $10,000. Sorry.
Yes, as I said, I'm prepared to do that. Now,
okay, now I'm going to interrupt.
Right.
This is a major challenge.
It is.
You've put it out on television. Norman Finkelstein, you have laid out one error. Whoever's interested served. Who's ever interested served. You did respond.
No.
You said 2 to 3,000, quoting citing Benny Morris, the Israeli historian. In fact, he said 2 to 300,000 Arabs. Now,
and let me make the point that I do make an argument. Here's the argument I make. I make make the argument that the issue is a complex one of the refugees, and that in fact many of the refugees, of the 700,000,
but you're citing Benny Morris.
Wait, of course.
And he made a different point than you did.
He made a point that strengthens my argument.
But it's wrong in your book. Whether or not it strengthens, whether or not it serves your argument.
Let me be very clear. If you make, I do make an argument. My argument is a very serious one. My argument is that many of the Palestinians were told to leave by their commanders. If in fact 200,000 were told to leave instead of 2,000, that strengthens my argument considerably. That is an argument that I make. If the book says 2,000 to 3,000, there are only two explanations. Either it is a typographical error, or, I have to check the book obviously, I was referring to a smaller phase. But it would be ridiculous for anybody to understate when the purpose would be to overstate.
Okay,
this is the kind of error anybody could make.
Let's leave that and go to another point.
What I'm going to do for the interest of time and trying to be respectful of Professor Dershowitz is I'll simply quote your statements in the book one after another slowly, and you can simply stop me and say, I can prove that, or I have the evidence.
Sure.
Page 206, you write, Israel is the only country in the Middle East to have abolished any kind of torture, in fact as well as in law.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Let's start with that one.
Yeah.
The Israeli Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories has a website, and I follow it quite closely.
So do I.
I went to the website, and I checked under the heading for torture. I'll ask again Amy Goodman, rather than myself, to simply read the first sentence for the latest issue of B'Tselem, and if she wants to continue down.
It's called B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories.
Please keep in mind, he said, Mr. Dershowitz said, in fact as well as in law. Please.
The first headline, it says torture. Interrogation by torture and absolutely prohibited by Israeli and international law.
Right.
Despite this, Israeli security forces breached the prohibition and torture Palestinians during interrogation.
I don't agree with that. I mean, we have a reasonable dispute about that. What Israel does, and what Israel did until 1999, was what the United States is now doing in Guantanamo. That is, they put people in uncomfortable shabak positions. They put hoods over their head, often foul-smelling hoods. They play loud music. There's a cover story in the Atlantic Monthly this month which talks about rough interrogation techniques, and it describes what the United States is doing, and it says that Israel used to do that. Some possibility it continues to do it. That's simply not the kind of torture that international law prohibits, and in fact my point is, in Jordan, torture is routine. In Egypt, it's routine.
Definitely.
The Israeli Supreme Court took an extraordinarily courageous decision in 1999. I commend everybody to read it. It's online, in which Justice Aaron Barak said that as a democracy, we must fight terrorism with one hand tied behind our back, but in the end, we have the upper hand because we comply with the rule of law. Israel is to be commended for its attempt to regulate and control the torture of ticking bomb terrorists. I am
so you stand by your statement that they do not torture
without any question, and that the Supreme Court has abolished it, and if anybody were to engage in an act that constituted torture, they would be in contempt of court.
Mr. Dershowitz.
Yes. And I am right and you're wrong on this
6 minutes.
I am simply right and
less
you're
than
wrong
6 minutes to go.
Mr. Dershowitz.
All right, let's
Amnesty International, who I know you think is an untrustworthy source, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, they all reached the same conclusion.
And they're wrong.
Israel still continues to practice torture. Well, you can say they're wrong, but let's be clear.
Describe what Israel does.
Sir, I'm not going to debate what torture
what do you define as torture?
I'm not an expert in the topic.
You certainly are not, but yet you're making an accusation.
I don't make the accusation, Mr. Dershowitz. You're confusing things. I go to the mainstream, respected human rights organizations, and I look at what they say.
Let me talk about amnesty.
And they apply the international standards.
Let me talk about amnesty.
You have a number of points here.
Okay,
we have 5 minutes to go.
I need to respond to this.
You did respond.
No, I didn't respond to this.
Let's go to number two.
I need to respond to amnesty.
You have 30 seconds to respond.
Okay.
I was
Amnesty International. Amnesty International recently said that Aharon Barak should not receive an international prize because He doesn't believe in human rights. He is one of the greatest advocates of human rights. They also, Amnesty also on
Alan
its website
Dershowitz, let me ask you a question. I'm going to interrupt for a second because you're on another point. B'Tselem. You just think B'Tselem is wrong.
No, B'Tselem is wrong.
Okay, Norman Finkelstein, next point.
Because they define torture in a way that would include what the United States is doing.
We have 4 minutes to go. 4 minutes to the end of the program.
Number 2, you write on page 126. There is no evidence that Israeli soldiers deliberately killed even a single civilian in Jenin.
Absolutely.
Now, Mr. Dershowitz, I looked carefully at your book. You don't like Amnesty International.
I'm a member of it.
You don't like...
I'm a member of
Amnesty International. I know, but on the question of Israel.
I'm a contributor to Israel. I like Amnesty on Israel in a great many instances, but I disagree with some of its conclusions.
And you don't particularly like B'Tselem.
I do like B'Tselem. If I were an Israeli, I'd belong to B'Tselem. So don't characterize my views. You don't know my views.
I read your book, or the book you purport to have written.
Now you're claiming somebody else wrote it?
I hope so. For your sake, I truly hope you did not write that book.
I proudly wrote it.
I think the honorable thing for you to do would be to say, I didn't write the book. I had no time to read it. I'm sorry.
I wrote every word of it.
That would be the honorable thing.
I urge... I have
okay, you've made the point about Jenin and whether an Israeli soldier...
No, I want to quote...
Deliberately shot a civilian.
Let's quote Human Rights Watch.
Yes.
They put out an extensive report on Jenin. Now, Human Rights Watch, you nowhere in your book mention. Nowhere. Let's see what Human Rights Watch concluded on Jenin. Quote, there's prima facie evidence that Israel committed, quote, war crimes in Jenin. Further, quote, and I want everyone to listen carefully, many of the civilian killings documented by Human Rights Watch amounted to unlawful or willful killings by the IDF. Please listen to the words.
I'm listening to the words, killings. And I deal with this very directly in my book.
And then Human Rights Watch copiously documents multiple cases of willful killings by Israel. Okay. What did Mr. Dershowitz write? What did Mr. Dershowitz write? There is not a single case of... you want to
not only not a single case in Jenin, but let me tell you why I make my point. I make my point because there is absolutely no incentive for the United States or for Israel or for any other democracy ever willfully to kill an innocent civilian. Every time an innocent civilian is killed, it hurts Israel. It hurts it domestically.
Allow me an example.
No, let me finish my point. It hurts it internationally. Now, every country engaged in urban guerrilla warfare will inadvertently kill civilians. But the very idea that an Israeli soldier who are trained in the idea of the holiness of arms, who get better training about avoiding civilians,
Allow me to read an example. Quote, among the civilian deaths were those of Kamu Zigir. Listen carefully. A 57-year-old wheelchair-bound man who was shot and run over by a tank on a major road outside the camp on April 10, even though he had a white flag attached to his wheelchair. That sounds pretty deliberate to me, Mr. Hirsch. If it's true,
the Israeli
the whole world is lying. Only Joan Peters tells the truth.
Wait. First of all, Joan Peters has never written about this issue. This issue is one where, of course, not only the Israeli military, but the United States has investigated Jenin. The United Nations has investigated Jenin. Some of the
Did they make up that example?
Some of the same
Let's get
sources.
This clear.
Some of the same
Did Human Rights Watch make up that example?
First said there
Did
were
Human Rights Watch make up that example?
Killed. No, that was an example.
Did Human Rights Watch? You said
they were given it to them by a source,
this is
and
disgraceful.
It was disputed.
You're shaming your institution.
I'm not, except first
You're
of all,
shaming your institution.
Let me make it very clear.
You
I don't
said,
speak on behalf of Harvard.
Not
I speak on behalf. Not a single one.
Did Human Rights Watch make that up?
No, but
did Human Rights Watch make it up?
Human Rights Watch attributed.
Did it make it up? No. Did they make up that example?
All right. On that note, we're wrapping up the program. Professor Dershowitz, let me ask this question. Yes. Did you investigate the Human Rights Watch report?
Of course I did, and I read it.
And you found that to be incredible.
I found that to be incorrect. Not only that, the United States government has found that to be incorrect.
On that note, we have to wrap up the show. I want to thank you both for being with us.
About 15 years later, I met him in a an Indian restaurant on the Upper East Side. I had very conflicted feelings about sitting with him at the table. When the whole issue of the
appendix, the plagiarism charge, and everything else. When it arose, Professor Dershowitz started to go around saying that my late mother was a Nazi collaborator. And at one point, I said to him, "Why did you say those things about my mother?" So he said to me, "Well, you wrote." I stopped him short, and I said, "Professor Dershowitz, don't go there. By the way, if you have any doubt about what I'm saying, I have the tape. It was taped, the conversation. So I'm retelling it, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to give it up." I said to him, "Professor Dershowitz, don't go there." I said to him, "I know your background, and I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge it's impressive. Professor Dershowitz, I read everything you've written in the last 40 years, and it's obviously worthless." It was interesting, his reaction. You know how he reacted? He just shrugged his shoulders like that, like, "Yeah, what could I do about it?" He didn't deny it. I said, "But you're clearly literate, sufficiently literate to know I never wrote anything like that. You know that was a complete lie." And you know how he responded? He said, "After what you did to me on Democracy Now!, what did you expect me to do?" In other words, he knew what he was saying was a lie, but it was tit for tat. You besmirched my name, I'll besmirch your name.